Munch, munch, scurry, scurry, scrape, scrape, munch, 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 scurry, scurry, was the repetitious chorus punctuated by momentary quiescence that gently escorted Thad's dreaming mind slowly back to his bed of tiny fairy duster leaves, intertwined with fallen twigs and blossoms. The sound was crisp and distinct, but very low volume. In fact, anyone even 1 yard away might not have heard anything at all. But Thad's left ear wasn't quite 10 inches from the bemused source of the sound, a little female deer mouse. Her beady black eyes gazed at Thad's breathing form, and her little round ears could hear the steady beat of Thad's heart as she stood perched on a root, now stretching down into her little stash in a nook between the root she stood on and another root, which formed a natural root cellar, wherein our little lady had stored seeds, rhizomes, and dried beetles, among other rodential dainties, against the day of want. The scurrying sound was the effect of Mrs. Deer Mouse systematically discriminating between her treasures. The scrape-scrape was the lifting up of her prize from her little cellar door, as she stood again erect with it, and the munch, 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 and repeat was her busy little teeth making quick gastronomic work of, alternately, a beetle, a seed, or the occasional edible dried fruiting body of her favorite mushroom. On the other side of the same root system, lower down, not 2 feet from where she stood, and hidden from Thad's vision, which was slowly returning to her world, were 7 singing mouse pups. Mrs. Mouse could hear them perfectly, though most of their notes were on what we men call the ultrasonic range of the sound spectrum, and inaudible to all but the most sensitive human ears. Thad, being 5 years old and retaining the finest of cilia in his ears, could in fact just barely hear them as a shrill, somewhat plaintive, and very distant whistle, punctuated by the occasional chirp. His eyes opened, and Mrs. Mouse froze, mid-munch. The voices of her pups reached a crescendo in her sensitive ears, and her milk let down, a week's worth of which couldn't fill 2 thimbles. She dropped the half-eaten dehydrated beetle back down through her cellar door, then slowly, almost imperceptibly, started to turn around. "Wait!" cried Thad. "Don't go!" She stopped, mid-turn, one paw in the air, one eye on the boy and the other on her escape route along the base of the roots, and back to the den and her waiting pups. "Why am I talking to a mouse?" a voice in Thad's head objected, but he cried out, "I'm thirsty, I'm hungry, and I'm lost." A solitary, salty teardrop fell from Thad's right eye, rolled off his cheek, and landed on the top of the blade of a fairy duster petal, which conveyed it parabolically down to the bed of little leaves, like an Olympic pole vaulter. Now, we must remember that Thad had not eaten anything at snack time, and now, having slept through lunch, and though he wasn't at all cold as he ought to have been out in the desert by now, he was indeed very hungry. "Slide down the smooth stone under the maiden's hair by the pool." Thad heard this instruction both distinctly and unexpectedly, not as a physical voice reverberating on his eardrums, but as a pure perception, quote-unquote spoken, in his mind. "Hello," said Thad. "Was that you?" But she was gone in a flash and already descending the sandy little entrance to her den and her septet of thirsty vocalists. "The maiden's hair? What's that?" thought Thad, more curious in his hunger, his little stomach was now rumbling, about the object of the slightly cryptic instructions than shocked, as he might otherwise have been, that a deer mouse could send thoughts, bypassing his physical ear, directly into the reverberations of his mind's ear. It was then that he leaned to his right in the counterclockwise direction Mrs. Mouse had gone around the fairy duster he was facing, and which served as her house and larder, and it was then that he saw the maiden. She seemed to be about 12, and she was lying prone, in a little green dress, asleep with her face pressed against a stone, under bushy, flowing hair, flowing backwards in a great heap above and behind her. But wait. No, Thad saw now it wasn't hair. It was a thick outgrowth of yellow-green ferns, and her face wasn't lying against the stone, but after all, her face was the stone, or was a part of the stone that stood out and gave the appearance of a face, along with two slenderer, or is it more slender, stones that gave the appearance of folded arms. Thad, who didn't even know one 5-syllable word, had never heard the word pareidolia. Thad rubbed his eyes, which had not adjusted yet from sleep to waking. It wasn't any brighter than it had been when he had crawled under the bushes earlier. Was it earlier that day, or was it the same day? As he cautiously crawled toward the stone image of the sleeping naiad, for naiad she was, or once had been, but that is another story for another day, he realized that what he had first had taken for a little green dress was actually emerald green moss on the stones that comprised her torso and chest. Thad cautiously crouched and crawled towards her, his eyes amazed to see the ferns vigorously growing in this arid environment. It was then that he noticed the crystal-clear pool of water against and above which the stone maiden appeared to have fallen asleep. He bent down, tasted it, and it was sweet on his dry lips. He bent down further, drank deeply of the little pool, and began to wash the sleep out of his eyes. He could see now that the pool was slowly filled by a little rivulet from the root base of the same clump of fairy dusters into which his savior, Mrs. Mouse, had disappeared just a moment before. Thad thought it couldn't hold more than 5 gallons, and where it went from there he couldn't tell for sure, but it was in motion and seemed to disappear somewhere underground. The water was so clear that he could see the changes of color in the stones that lined the sides of the little pool. The maiden's hair was indeed a cluster of ferns, less fern-like in the typical sense than the fairy duster leaves themselves were, but with more rounded but irregular, brighter green leaves, which had a soft little teeth along their ridges. They looked golden in contrast to the very dark green moss that covered the maiden's body. They flowed a little chaotically at first, but then in a distinct direction, in back of the maiden. But Thad had been too overwhelmed at first sight to notice this. Now we must remember that all this was under an almost unbroken canopy of fairy duster clusters, so that the scene Thad was now seeing was almost invisible, camouflaged by the apparently endless repetitions of twigs, blossoms, and fern-like leaves, until the alternate image, vaguely created in his mind by Mrs. Mouse's telepathic suggestion, had prepared his open mind to see it. You and I would probably look once at the whole scene and have seen only more fairy dusters, because our more calcified adult minds, without focusing on the possibility of other images and without the nudge toward another expectation, would naturally fill in our perceptual gaps with, well, just more of the same. Thad's imagination had played an anticipatory role, and yet he was sure as could be that the pool and the stone maiden were really there, though he had not yet realized her quote-unquote hair was really pointing a specific way. Leaning over the pool, after his long drink, with his arms on the side opposite the face of the stone maiden, Thad shook the droplets of water from his face. He had rather curly brown hair, and focused on a little ripple in the pool one of the droplets had just made. His thirst was fully slaked, and for the moment he forgot his hunger. He saw one smooth and unusually rounded and aerodynamic-looking stone near the edge, and did what any little boy would do. There wasn't enough water for skipping stones, but he could make a ripple and count the rings. He dropped the stone in the center of the pool and started counting ripples. 2, 3, 4, and then they hit the sides. Thad was reaching for another stone when he suddenly stopped. Had he seen? But how? He looked straight again at the pool, and it looked the same as before. He turned again to find his stone, and once again, when the pool was over to his side, Thad saw in his left eye a bay-roan horse in the pool. He looked straight in again. Again, nothing. Puzzled, Thad then realized the thing could only be seen from the side, from what Mrs. Aguilar would later have taught him was his quote-unquote peripheral vision. So Thad focused on the stones over to the side and saw, out of focus and kind of brightly, with ill-defined edges and indistinct features, like a Monet, the bay roan being led by a young woman or a tall girl on foot to a little blue pool, about thrice as big again as his, and the Stone Maiden's little pool, in what seemed to be a little grassy clearing in front of a grotto. The tall living maiden, who was decked in something like a blue velvet blouse, and what he at first mistook for a deeper blue ankle-length dress, but was really more like a split skirt for horse riding, seemed to be wearing a thin white crown around her brow. Or... no. Thad inadvertently looked directly again, and the image, of course, vanished again. He focused again on a bluish stone to the side of the pool about a foot in front of the Stone Maiden's left arm, and now saw in the reflection of the pool the tall maiden again. It was not really a crown around her forehead, but a slender garland of white flowers. The roan seemed to be nibbling at the grass now, and the maiden gathered something. It was firewood. Thad soon realized, as she removed some kind of tinder box and a parcel that had in it what was apparently a living coal. Thad, enchanted, saw the tinder leap to flame in her hands. Once her little fire was blazing from the earth. She seemed to have rather easily dug 2 holes, one for coals and another to vent them. She removed a little parcel from the horse's saddlebag and began to unroll little flat cakes with some sort of wax paper separating them. She began to bake them one by one, like tortillas or pancakes. Thad shouted to himself, completely enraptured now by the growing culinary anticipation. All his temporarily offset hunger came rushing back to him, and his stomach anticipated tasting the cakes until he realized now, bitterly of course, that this was some sort of magic, tantalizing him from behind the screen of this. What was it? Sort of a liquid television. He couldn't possibly eat those cakes. It really was like watching TV. He could see the tiny horse, the tiny rider, the tiny food. And yet... Thad looked away in frustration as his stomach growled and gurgled. Then he looked back, or sideways, as it were. The tall young maiden was arranging the pancakes, now fried, into another parcel. She stood up, left them uneaten, and proceeded gracefully into the grotto, apparently to pray. "If only I could be there," he moaned. She seemed nice enough. She would help him. She would feed him and would probably help him get home or back to his class. He no longer even had any thought for any punishment that might await him, but all he saw in every direction, as ever, was endless clumps of fairy dusters, and all he saw when he looked up were their dense and densely blossoming branches and foliage, pierced by the occasional ray of sunlight. And to stand up, even for a small boy, was impossible. "How long have I been here?" he wondered aloud to himself, or whoever might be listening. "And where is here? Anyways, I'm hungry." Thad seemed to smell those pancakes, but told himself it had to be his imagination, so intense was his longing. They seemed to smell like coconut oil and honey. Thad buried his face in his hands. 4 seconds later, in a moment of remembrance and realization, he looked up. Slide down the smooth stone under the maiden's hair. Thad had finally remembered his instructions. He walked around the stone maiden gingerly and counterclockwise, though he could not tell time, half expecting her to wake up with a burst of sudden somnambulation. In his peripheral vision he could see the tall maiden in the pool had not yet returned to her camp from the grotto, and the parcel of cooked pancakes was still sitting there by her little fire. He followed the stone maiden's hair ferns, from her brow, over her back, into where? There seemed to be a little crevasse, not a yard behind her head, over which the vigorous growth of Maiden's hair ferns rolled and tumbled down. From the other side of the pool, it had looked like continuous fairy duster bushes behind the statue. It was not until one crawled around behind and felt with one's hands that the crevasse was perceptible, almost overgrown with the maiden's hair, and so deep that Thad could not see the bottom of it. Indeed, he might have slipped into it unawares, had he not proceeded cautiously, in spite of his hunger. Following instructions, Thad felt with his hands underneath the ferns and perceived by feeling that they were tethered with a little grabbing root-like tethers to an otherwise smooth stone slide which sloped down into darkness very steeply. Had Thad's father measured it with a transit, the decline would perceptibly have fallen to 60 degrees, and then who knows how steeply, maybe to a sheer drop into the darkness below. Thad, who was tired of crawling, sort of duck-walked back to the other side of the little pool in front of the stone naiad. He chose a stone, carefully reapproached the point where the maiden's hair flowed over the edge, and dropped the stone. It clacked against the decline twice, then against the far wall, then went silent. He waited, but didn't hear it hit the bottom. Maybe the floor was shallow and lined with more leaves and blossoms, like his makeshift bed of, had it been the night before? Anyway, maybe wasn't good enough. Thad went around to the next clump of fairy dusters on the other side of the naiad's feet to pee on them and think about his situation. How could he go down a slide into darkness, and who knows what else? And why would he? Because a mouse told him to do it? He finished peeing and decided to explore a little first. He would keep walking this direction more, breaking branches every time and not getting out of sight of the last broken branch. He remembered the story of Hansel and Gretel, but since he had no breadcrumbs, this was the best he could do. If he had had breadcrumbs, I'm sure Thad would have eaten them. And we oughtn't blame him. That got him nowhere after 5 minutes, so he returned to the pool and did the same in the opposite direction, from the stone maiden's head and thenceforth. Again, all Thad saw were more and more and more dense clumps of fairy dusters as far as the eye could see, which Thad admitted to himself wasn't far. Then he tried doing the same perpendicular to her face and even diagonally in both directions. Finally, the only direction left was behind her. The crevasse was so small across, Thad almost thought he could leap it with a running start, but one must be able to stand up before one can run. Ignoring his hunger, Thad determined to work to break enough branches and clear enough leaves and blossoms from the floor before the crevasse to make a sort of running tunnel for himself to gather momentum. Whether the branch of Maiden's hair snapped up of her own volition to grab Thad's ankle, or whether it had been pinioned under another branch and loosened at just that moment from the vibration of his running in that otherwise still and strangely serene ecosystem, he neither knew nor cared. He only knew that as soon as he had leapt confidently from the stone naiad's side of the crevasse, instead of landing firmly on the far side, he felt first his ankle snagged, or grabbed, his chest slammed against the ledge on which he had intended his feet to land, his bottom bump into the steep descent of the opposite side, and finally, completely airborne now, and with the wind knocked out of him, falling down, 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 and still falling, as the light from above vanished into a tiny slit, and thence into utter darkness.